Now I will officially say good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And I want to make one announcement before we begin. The exercises for the second set of exercises are now available. They are called Objective Communication Exercises Part 2, and to avoid all confusion, they begin numbering on page 9 since Part 1 ended on page 8. And for next week, please read the first 2 of the 4 articles or essays that make up the exercises. Number 1 is called Primacy of Consciousness, Some Manifestations. Number 2 is Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, and they run between them from pages 9 through 14. The authors are students in the course, and I left their names off in deference to the requirement for anonymity, but since that time they've told me they don't object to my indicating who they are, so next week I'll probably be talking to them about the papers, and you'll find out at that time. These are reprinted, retyped exactly as submitted, with only typographical errors altered. In regard to the first 2, I would like you to read them and evaluate them as philosophic presentation of ideas. Is the theme clear? Is it concretized? Is it purposeful? Does it motivate the audience? All the principles that we've discussed apropos of writing philosophically, writing on philosophic ideas, and then be prepared next time to volunteer your estimate, your comments, positive or negative. As I say, we'll take the first 2 next time, and the last 2 articles please read for Lecture 10. And that's the moral and the practical and racism, and those 2 we will cover Lecture 10. So that completes the homework assignment for the course. Now we are going to continue the section on argument, on arguing about ideas, and we're going to have 2 presentations. In each case, I would like you again to be active during the presentation and to judge it as it goes from 2 aspects. Partly content. Do you agree with what's said? Are the points made by the side that you would be expected to agree with true? Are there crucial omissions and so on? And also, secondly, from the point of view of the method of arguing. Do the people go for essentials, trying to develop fundamentals? Do they concede the opponent's premises? Etc. The kinds of points that we discussed last time. I suggest you take notes of the high points that you can then refer to and try and form an estimate of the caliber of the arguing. Understanding that this is unrehearsed and that these 2 gentlemen on my right have just been introduced to each other a minute ago. So there's nothing prearranged here, and we're going to interrupt after about 10 minutes or so and give you a chance to organize your thoughts and then discuss it. I also want to remind you that we're going to try to be a bit more philosophic in terms of content. In other words, we'll give a little attention after commenting on the specific argument that we hear to the topic as such. And that means specifically that if you have any further arguments that you regard as important for or against, that you want to discuss, that you're not sure you know the answer to, or you want to be sure, is this correct? In other words, you want to explore the actual topic and ask purely philosophic questions about it, rather than strictly on the method of arguing it. Within the limits of time, I'm going to permit that on both of the arguments this evening. So make a side note on that, but let's save philosophic discussion until we've, in each case, discussed the argument. Now, the first argument or discussion is on the topic of God or religion, and it features Mr. Wayne Rossman, who was going to be taking the atheist viewpoint, against Mr. Robert Thomas, who's going to be defending a religious viewpoint, obviously as an exercise only. So I will turn it over to them, give them a moment to get their positions and get used to the mic and so on, and then they'll start. Okay. All right, you can start whenever you're ready.
Okay. I understand that you don't believe in anything called God. I do. I just like to say what I think God is. To me, God is a superior living entity, superior to any other living entity, regardless of what that other living entity is or where it lives. And that's what I mean when I say God.
So you say that that's your definition of God. Are you saying at the same time that you believe that God exists, or that you accept the existence of a God?
Well, I believe God as an entity that's extremely powerful, extremely creative, extremely intelligent, and responsible for my existence, both for my existence and the existence of everything in reality. That's what I believe.
Yes, but you used the word believe, and I'm familiar with that word, and I think that it means, according to the dictionary, that you're placing your faith in something for which no logical proof exists. And if you use the word believe, then you're saying, in essence, that you're placing your faith in something for which no logical proof exists.
Well, I don't know exactly what you mean by faith, but I'm convinced of what I'm saying. For example, I wouldn't maintain that God built the Statler Hilton Hotel. That's silly. Individuals did that. What I say is God created the means. For example, science. And in science, there's a principle which states nothing can be created or destroyed, only change in form. Which means everything that is, was. Everything that is, always will be. And when my Baltimore Catechism told me God was and always will be, and that's what God is. And therefore I'm convinced God is, because there is something in reality that always was and always will be. And that's what they told me God was, and that's what I'm convinced of.
So, in other words, you're saying they told you, and you've accepted what they have told you without proving it to yourself or anybody else?
Not.
Just hold the mic down a little bit.
Not exactly. For example, I know that everything in the universe always was. Its form was different, but it always was. It is now, and it always will be. And to me, that's God, and that's what I have to hold. What I don't know completely is that it's an actual living physical being, but it's something that's superior to me and superior to any other living entity, and is responsible for my existence, my life, my mind, my everything.
Well, if, for the sake of argument, what you say or what you believe happens to be true, how do you place something for which no proof exists above what your senses tell you, what your mind tells you?
I try not to. I'll agree with you. I'll agree with you. There doesn't seem to be too much evidence for God. But what I would say is, see, I would never argue like some people would that God is unknowable, because then you're arguing about nothing. I would say that more likely, to me, God is unknown. That is, there is enough evidence out there, if I'm willing to check it out, look into it, the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, some historical writings, different things, that I could prove the existence of God to myself if I wish to. So I say God is unknown, but that doesn't mean he doesn't exist.
But
I'm sorry, that it doesn't exist. God is sexless.
But you are saying that something exists, so the burden of the proof, okay, if I say that I do not accept the existence of your God, then you have to prove that to me.
Yeah, and I would first refer you to the Bible, then I would refer you to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay, but if you refer me to the Bible, you could probably refer me to the story of Moses, for instance, who, the Bible says, raised his arms and the sea opened up and everybody walked through the middle of the sea. Now, well, do you accept that?
What I accept is it's been shown historically that when People from Israel went to the Dead Sea. It was at low tide. When later, when the soldiers came, it was at high tide. What I am saying is the Bible made it dramatic, and that God is the one who caused it to be at low tide when they came and caused it to be at high tide when the soldiers came.
I really don't know what to say to that, except that I've never seen it happen, and I have really never met anybody that can seriously say.
Well, so let me tell you something that happened to me Sunday night. I was standing on the platform at 34th Street and 6th Avenue on a subway. And a young boy, when a train was coming in, pushed me. And I nearly fell into the tracks and I was nearly crushed to death. Fortunately, momentarily, my body went backwards and the train missed me. If I say the hand of God pulled me back, who are you to say it wasn't?
What did the hand look like?
I didn't see it, but I felt it, and it saved my life.
Well, I feel a lot of things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they exist in reality.
That's true. But, so do you believe in Thomas Jefferson?
I accept the existence of a person named
Thomas Jefferson was a myth.
Jefferson.
He was invented by the Founding Fathers, and you couldn't prove to me otherwise.
But there are pictures that have been painted.
I have paintings of God.
No, I haven't. If you have a painting of God, please show it to me. I've never seen one. I've seen paintings of a man that was called Jesus Christ. I've never seen a painting of God, but that is not what we're talking about. Somebody could imagine that a God exists, and they could paint what they imagine, but does not
Well, someone could
prove
imagine
the point.
that Thomas Jefferson existed and painted
No,
a picture of Jefferson.
There is historical evidence for the existence.
Such as?
He wrote the Declaration of Independence.
There is some evidence to indicate that he did not physically write the document that Benjamin Franklin did.
Okay, let's say there is evidence that we're getting off the subject.
No, I want to know.
We're talking about God. We're not talking about.
We're talking about evidence.
Okay, and there is no logical proof that God, your God, as you define Him, exists. Even Thomas Aquinas.
The Bible?
I have read parts of the Bible, but the Bible
Have you read the Dead Sea Scrolls?
I have not read the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay. Have you read the historical writings? Have you read a book called The Incredible Christians?
No, I haven't.
Have you read Anthony Flou's God and Philosophy?
No, I haven't.
How about George Smith's Atheism, The Case Against God?
No, but the point is, just because somebody wrote these books does not prove that your God exists. There was a philosopher, I forget his name, who said that if a tree falls in the woods and you are not there, that the tree did not fall. But the tree did fall, and all you would have to do to prove it is go to that point and see the tree lying on the ground.
I'm not positive, but I think the same philosopher, it was Bishop Berkeley, I believe, who said, if God perceives the tree falling, then in fact it did fall.
I think we could go on for hours, and I think it's about 10 minutes right now. And
yeah, but the thing is, it's 8 minutes and 28 seconds. The thing is this, I have read Atheism, The Case Against God. I have read God and Philosophy. I have read John Gall's speech against God. And I know all the arguments. I know all the arguments for atheism. Apparently you have not read the Bible, you have not read the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have not been inside of a church, you have not examined the life of Jesus. I think I got a better case.
Well, I have done a few of those things, and I still have not, from what I've done, found any logical proof that proves that your so-called God exists.
Thank you very much, both. that was very excellent without yet commenting on the content, on the spontaneity of both sides. Mr. Thomas, I believe you were actually educated in a Catholic...
That's right. For grade school and 2 years of Catholic high school.
2 years of Catholic high school, so you've had a lengthy education, and you argue very well, so it definitely shows. Let's take just a minute now to organize and collect our thoughts. All right. This was obviously a brief snippet out of what would be a much longer argument. If you had to decide on the case for or against there, how would you decide? How many, just judging from the nature of the argument, how many would take, I'll give you three choices here, that one won, the other won, or that it was neutral, it was a standoff. How many would say it was a standoff? A small sprinkling of hands. How many would say the religious position came out ahead? There's a large majority there. And how many would say the atheistic position came out ahead? Well, a few hands, but I think you're a little prejudiced in advance. Now, this is very good for illustrating certain things. I'd like to hear, before we start, what kind of, before I say anything, what kind of comments you would make. If you think something was well done about this, first of all, by either side, what would you say was well done? Yes?
I think Mr. Thomas had a lot of good arguments.
You say you think Mr. Thomas, that is the pro-religious side, had a lot of good arguments. What were his arguments?
Well, the one that got me was the one on 34th Street.
Or you like the one on 34th Street? That actually was true because he told me before he started that he had that experience.
Yes, I overheard him say
yes. But now tell me the logic of how that got you. Why did that get you?
It felt spontaneous. It really happened to him.
You know, the experience actually happened, that is, that he was pushed and pulled back. But the question is, what's the connection between that and God?
Because he felt that God was responsible for saving his life.
Well, but then if only you say because he felt that God is responsible for saving his life, that's what he said. But logically speaking, that's not too good an argument, because you can feel anything, right?
He didn't win on logic.
Oh, I see. You say he didn't win on logic, but you think he won then on what?
When I said good arguments, I was contradicting my own.
Well, but then how would you reword it? You said you were contradicting yourself, but how would you reword it? He had a more forceful presentation.
Right, pseudo-fact.
Yeah, he knew exactly what analogies he wanted to use, what authorities he was going to quote, what type of experiences he was going to cite, and he was ready, and he was obviously trained. And people can be trained for many different positions, but you could tell he was trained because as soon as something was said, it was like, a certain button was pressed, and then he gave us the response. So in that sense, you didn't have obviously the experience, Mr. Rossman, that he had. So you had a certain disadvantage there. And it is true that yours was a more forceful and more assured presentation. Am I correct? You were slightly taken aback there?
Well, I was. First of all, I wouldn't. If I was really arguing, and this is what I should have done, I wouldn't have been smiling.
Right. You say your first mistake was to smile, yeah?
When he first started, no, I'm saying I wouldn't smile. I take this very seriously.
Right.
It's ridiculous.
Right.
The point is that when he started off, I changed my tactics a little bit, and I thought that by being humorous about it, or just maybe being a little silly about it, that I could prove how silly.
Now, I just want to repeat this so people can hear. You said originally you decided you wouldn't smile because you take this very seriously. But then at the beginning you changed your tactics and you thought, in effect, you would ridicule it or make it look silly.
No,
or what?
No, I'm saying that if I did this in real life.
Yes.
Okay.
If you did it in real life, you'd be serious.
I'm very serious.
And here you smile. And did you find that undercut you in the argument?
I couldn't help it because what he was saying was so...
But on the other hand, you didn't expect fully what he was saying. Is that correct?
Expect him
Do you yourself think that you answered it effectively?
Well, I tried to define some of the terms, and I tried to, if he's saying he believes in something, for instance, then there's a definition to the word believe. It means place faith in something.
Right. You did try. The one point that you did try several times, but you never did get him to, you never hammered it home, but the point you did try to get was that this is faith, this is belief, he has no evidence. You tried that point, only you never really got there in the sense of making that a convincing point. And there were several reasons for that. Let's take that point. Why was it? Although you were, in other words, you were trying an epistemological tack. In other words, theory of knowledge, method of how does he know? And instead of directly attacking God, you were saying you have no way of knowing this. But instead of him saying, which you had more or less hoped or expected, well, if it's faith, I guess I have no proof, so I'm refuted, he jumped in and said various things that were very realistic for a trained person. It's very infrequent that a person will say, yes, my belief is absolutely arbitrary, I got nothing to go on at all, it's just my blind faith, and then throw himself at your feet and say, here I am, walk all over me. In the real life case, it's a mixture of faith and non-faith. In other words, it's faith, and then when you say that's arbitrary, he'll say, oh no, and throw in an analogy or an alleged historical parallel or some experience he had or whichever, and say, isn't that evidence? Now, what is the strategy that you have to adopt in this case if you're going to take the tack of faith, which is a very essential point in arguing religion? What do you have to do in order to bring that to fruition in an argument, in order to make it successful, which you didn't do? Yes, Harry.
I think you should have gotten a statement of acceptance of the ground rules from the opponent to say, will you restrict yourself only to rational evidence? Because he very cleverly wouldn't say he did know or didn't know. He kept sliding around.
Well, one thing is true. In this case, the religious side was very adroit in moving from there is evidence to there isn't. Because part of the time he was giving evidence, and the other part of the time he was saying it's unknown. Not unknowable, he said, but unknown. But what is an obvious comeback to if it's unknown, even just unknown? How do you know it then? On what basis? And then when he gives the historical data, like the parallel to Jefferson, or the Dead Sea Scrolls or whichever, before you argue with that, the first thing you have to do is what? Before you try and invalidate that, what is the first thing you have to do? Yes?
Well, I think you have to ask him how that constitutes proof, how it proves.
Well, the first thing you say, ask him how that constitutes proof. That, of course, would be helpful. But the first thing I would do is see, is he going to rely on this or is it hit and run? In other words, before I'd even go into it, I would say, well, look, before we discuss Thomas Jefferson parallel, I want to find out, are you really going to rest the case for God on that parallel? In other words, you really think that the two are similar, and if I can show you that there's an essential difference between those two, you will withdraw your argument for God and become an atheist. Or in other words, is this just a debating gimmick, and as soon as I hit it, you're going to vanish and show up somewhere else, or you really believe this? Because then we'll have to take it slowly and see, you see. That would give him pause, because then he realizes he's sticking all of his eggs in one basket, whereas one of the things that he was able to do, which is exactly what's done in real life, is have an egg in 12 different baskets, and each time you break one, he just brings out another basket. And by the time you get to the 12th one over again, he's got a whole new supply, and it just goes on forever. You have to pin him down, you see, and you have to pin him down by getting him to agree on the method he's going to use. Yes? No, that lady behind you. Yes.
You have to say from the outset, let's talk about principles and forget the concrete.
Well, you say, wouldn't you have to say from the outset, let's talk about principles and forget the concretes? Well, which principles? Because after all, God is in effect a concrete. He's one. Which?
Start with belief or anyone that he raises, but the pro-God guy was always on the offensive.
Well, the pro-God guy was on the offensive. Well, he had the positive view in this case, so he would have to be on the offensive. It's hard for an atheist to be on the offensive in the sense of proving his view, because he has the negative, you see.
But he could prove, say, say, okay, prove your case, but not by concrete.
But give me just in pattern, what would be an example of not by concretes, but more, you mean get him to define theory of knowledge? Well, if you could pitch the discussion on that level, that would obviously be desirable, but in most cases, it wouldn't stay on that level because it's very abstract. If you could say to this religious person, look, before we even discuss God, let's discuss knowledge. What do we take as knowledge? What does it rest on? What kind of things are we going to regard as evidence and what not? If I feel that I have a convention of gremlins in my living room discussing Tutti Frutti ice cream, is that evidence or not? You know, discuss various examples without reference to God and then go to God, then you're okay. But in a normal discussion, you can't do that because evidence, theory of knowledge, and so on is very abstract. And in trying to specify in the context of an argument what is evidence, immediately the one person is going to say, but isn't the Dead Sea Scrolls evidence? And they're going to plunge right back into the argument. So theoretically, it would be nice, but in actual practice, it would be very hard to have a long epistemological argument, which what would be required, really, to resolve it. But there is something you could do. And one thing, as I say, you could do is get him in advance to stake his argument on what he's calling evidence. If he makes the parallel to Thomas Jefferson, then say, fine. Now, what should be then your answer once he would say, for instance, okay, he is relying on the parallel to Thomas Jefferson? After all, you haven't directly perceived Thomas Jefferson. You haven't directly perceived God. So in both cases, you're taking, this is the religious argument that he just presented. In both cases, you're taking it, in effect, on something other than first-hand evidence, simply by indirect evidence. And in one case, you have the Declaration of Independence. In the other case, you have the Bible. In each case, you have a document written by the unperceived entity in question. So what's the difference? That's the argument, in effect. So putting it more generally, the idea is any inference to an unperceived entity is in the same category. If we can do it with one, we can do it with all. Now the question is that true, or is there some essential difference between our present-day inference to Thomas Jefferson and the inference to God? Now, the gentleman tried to say he's never seen a picture of God. And that is relevant if it was pressed a little further, relevant to the difference, but he didn't press it because the answer was there is pictures. And of course, there are symbolic representations, you know, on the Sistine ceiling and so on, of God. So that in itself was not an unanswerable statement. Now, what would you have to do if you're going to press the distinction between those two to the point where he'd have to withdraw it? Yes.
Well, it's important not just to have evidence for, but to see whether what you're asserting contradicts anything else that you know.
Well, you're saying it's important not just to have evidence for, but to see whether what you're asserting contradicts anything else that you know. So you're suggesting that God involves a certain contradiction of other things that we know. But the way whereas Thomas Jefferson doesn't. But the way you word it, you imply, well, maybe there is some evidence for God, only there's also evidence against him, and there isn't for Jefferson, which is a fair concession. The question is, can there be evidence for God? That's the question. Now, if you know clearly in advance the answer to that, then you can wipe out all the attempts to base it on the Dead Sea Scrolls or Thomas Jefferson parallels or subway experiences or whichever. Now, why is evidence for God as such an impossibility? Under certain circumstances, it is. And if you know that point, you don't have to argue 10 different varieties of alleged evidence because you know the whole thing is out to begin with, if you make a certain point at the outset. Why is that now? Someone who hasn't spoken yet? Yes.
Well, someone like Thomas Jefferson, he had a birth certificate. There was certain evidence that he did live through concretes. And there's nothing about God, I mean, a document that he had signed or...
Well, that's, as you're saying it, of course, it's true, but it's not per se convincing. You say about Thomas Edison, there's evidence, there's a birth certificate, and so on. About God, there's nothing that he signed. That's too narrow, because if you're going to argue it on those terms, people will say, well, the Bible, or they'll say the whole universe is God's signature. You know, I've heard that one too. So you know, the question is, you see, what you take as evidence, and whether there can be evidence for such a thing as God. Well, yes, Mr. John.
If you were pressed on what God actually is, it would entail certain contradictions, and you'd be able to show them that God has no identity.
All right. Now, you said you were pressed on what God actually is. You would see that involves certain contradictions, that God has no identity, and therefore, presumably, that would in itself destroy the possibility of argument. But what does that suggest as an arguing strategy that was not employed here by the atheistic side, and that it was one of the real problems that permitted the whole thing to go on? What one thing did you really fail to do that left you in the position that you didn't know what to take as evidence or what not as evidence? Yes?
Well, I think any evidence given can be explained without reference.
You're not answering the question I asked you. You said any evidence given can be explained without reference to God, but I'm asking a different question. What one thing could the atheist side have done that would have laid the base to show there is no evidence for God? That there can be no evidence for God, if he had done a certain thing. Which thing? Yes.
Well, he's saying that he believes in God, and he's arguing that firsthand he thinks that God exists. He's not arguing that Thomas Jefferson exists, but if he believes in God, you can say, you tell me your experience, you prove to me.
No, but he did that. He told him his experience. You say he didn't give his own experiences that established the existence of God, but he did. He didn't prove it, correct. In other words, his experiences didn't actually show what he claimed they showed, but the question is, how are we going to establish that in the course of an argument without a whole discussion of epistemology? That's what I want to know. What is if we're arguing, let's suppose you heard an argument between two people, and one of them said there is a gloop in the lobby of this hotel, and the other said there is not. And one of them said, well, it's just like Thomas Jefferson, and the other one said it is not, and the other says, did you read The Theory and Practice of Gloop by Professor Schmohawk? And the other one said no. What is the obvious question that would be insistent in the forefront of your mind before you could resolve this?
I want to see it. What is it?
No, you don't want to see it. You wouldn't even know what you want to see yet. What? What is a gloop? Right. You'd want a definition, right? Now, in some arguments, it's not necessary. But in the case of God, it is essential, because the essence of the argument revolves around the type of entity that the religious person is trying to establish. Now, you will see that the religious side here was very cagey about that, because he gave definitions, an abundance of definitions, which switched all the time, and none of which were God. And that's what I would now like you to point out. This is the first thing you see, the essential thing that you would have to do. When he gives a definition, you shouldn't regard that as, oh, well, that's just a preliminary, now we're going to get on to how does he prove it. You have to stop right there and say, well, what type of entity is this? Are we sure we know what we're talking about? And if you analyze what he said, you'll see that part of the time he was talking about God and part he wasn't, and any plausibility he got is by the oscillation. Now, he began, I copied it down, as God is a superior living entity. That's it, without further definition. You did not ask for any elaboration, the atheist side, of that. Now, per se, a superior living entity is hardly an impossibility. I mean, superior is undefined in that statement, so it could mean stronger, an alien being on another dimension that's more intelligent, more cunning, who knows what. There's many naturalistic, realistic possibilities under superior living entity. Therefore, if that's what God is, if that's his definition, what would be the appropriate comeback in such a case? Well, if that's all you mean, you're talking about a question of science. You're asking, in effect, is Mars populated by a living entity which has powers that we don't. I don't know. That's a scientific question, and we wouldn't argue that philosophically. So is that what you worship when you go to church? Is that what you pray to? You'd have to ask a few things like that, and immediately what would happen? If you press that definition, you'd have to say, well, no, I don't mean just like human beings, but with more muscles, or with a higher IQ. When I say superior, I mean, now, he won't tell you right away. If he did, the whole thing would be over because you would have won. But he'd say something like, responsible for the important things in the universe. Isn't that one of the phrases you used, or something approximately like that? Say, responsible for the important things in the universe. Now, what you have to acquire, you see, is the ability to take these things literally and then play it back to the person. Well, if that's what you mean, is it this? And then they say, oh, no, and you have to drive them till they finally admit what they're saying. Now, suppose the person says, God is that which is responsible for the important things in the universe. What is then the first question? What are the important things that he is responsible for? Like what? Wars? Sex? What? What is it? Then suppose he'll say for existence as a whole, say. Then, of course, if you go into God is that which is responsible for existence, fine. Then you've got a definition that does capture the essence of God, so you've accomplished stage one. But you see, that's very different from a superior living being. Why is it very different if you say God is that which is responsible for existence as a whole? Why is that different than, and much easier to argue about than, a superior living entity? Yes, Ms. Poe. Because then you said God is outside of the universe. Or put another way, then you've said what? God is outside science. He's outside nature. He's supernatural. He's outside sensory experience. He's part of a dimension that completely transcends any percepts, argument, logic, reason, science, law, etc. If you establish that, what immediately happens then to any claim for evidence? You see, the main thing you have to do in an argument of this type is to show the person that you cannot argue for God, that God and argument are two opposites, because argument takes place within the universe on the basis of sensory experience and can only lead to something establishable on the basis of experience. God, by his nature, is a supernatural being. It's not just another thing in the universe, it's something in another dimension, a dimension completely opposite to the one in which we live. And you'd have to elaborate the ways. And therefore, as religious people themselves, the educated ones, concede something outside the capacity to argue. You simply can't argue for it, is the consensus of most modern theologians, absolutely correctly. But you see, if you go from superior living entity, sounds like it's a thing in the universe that you can argue about. And if you then simply jump from that to responsible for all of existence, but keeping the connotation of something in this world, natural, intelligible, and so on, knowable, as he said, then you have your God and eat it too, and so you can win any argument. You can win any argument because you can make arbitrary claims on the basis of your supernatural definition, and as soon as the person says, what do you prove? How do you prove that? You switch back to your natural definition. Now here's another case where this took place. And this is common in the religious camp, and it's a good example of the role of definitions. He says nothing can be created or destroyed. Therefore, something must always have existed, and I call God that which always is and will be. And I even refuse to call it by the term he, because God is sexless. Now, certainly true that nothing can be created or destroyed, and that all that can exist is change of form, and therefore there must be something which always is and will be. That much is unquestionably true. That was what, Aquinas', isn't this his fifth argument? Who can remember? I haven't taught that for so long. I think this is Aquinas' either third argument, I guess, for the existence of God. So it's certainly true as far as that point. There's something which always is and will be. Now, what is the only problem with that as a definition or argument for God? Yes, Mr. Crow. Then you'd say, what is it that always is and will be the universe? And then you say, do you make a distinction between the sheer stuff, the physical material, and an alleged supernatural creator of it? Now, when you simply say something always is and will be, that leaves wide open, is it a supernatural thing or not? You haven't given any evidence. I say it was the stuff we see around us, physical matter in different forms. If you say it's something beyond that, transcendent, supernatural, then you have to tell me what. Now, here again, you taking the atheist side, let that pass by. But you see, and the reason the audience had the net impression, because I did myself at the religious side, one is he kept giving definition after definition, and it seemed like he could give a radio program on God's nature, you know. He knew more about God than anybody, you know, for many years, and he just kept bringing it out each time, and you just let him get away with it, you see. Now, what you have to do is decide when these characterizations come forth, is this God or not? If it's something natural, finite, part of this physical world, it's not, you can't call it by the term God. And therefore you can believe it, but it's not relevant to establishing God. If it's relevant to establishing God, it's something supernatural, infinite, indefinable, beyond all argument, and then there's no use giving evidence for it. So you see, the essential strategy of the religious side is to use a natural definition to justify using evidence to come to a supernatural conclusion, which, if you're aware that that strategy is being employed, you can puncture at the very outset. You see, by insisting on a definition, isolating the supernatural character of it, and then repudiating evidence as such. That, in essence, is the strategy that I would suggest in that type of argument. Now, what is the thing that, put more broadly, that you didn't do in terms of method of argument that would be valuable now in any topic? And I'd like to stress this as a kind of positive suggestion for any argument now. Putting it more broadly, what is it that you failed to do on the atheist side that was similar to the pro-capitalist argument last time? So we have two examples to learn a general principle. Yes? When you say argue in terms of fundamentals, that's true. But I would put one more word in there. Establish your own fundamentals. That is, you had a tendency, in a similar way to last time, if you remember the argument on capitalism, to let the other side come on strong, and you just kind of reeled. Each new one hit you, and you kind of gulped and picked up, and you start again from scratch. But what you have to do when you go into these arguments, of course, I know you don't, in normal life, it just comes out of the blue. But even so, if you're preparing or if you're thinking about it afterwards, you have to decide what are the essentials of my case. Really the hardcore foundation, without which I'm lost. See, if I'm arguing on capitalism, then in favor of capitalism, I know I have to get in early. That it's the system based on rights, and that I believe in selfishness and reason. That's my foundation. Then I can go from there wherever the argument takes. If it's God, then and I'm taking the polemical side, I'm trying to argue against religion, the first thing I know I have to do is establish the difference between this and reason. Make it clear that I don't regard this as natural but supernatural, and therefore reason is and evidence is out. And that is a kind of insistent order from the beginning. So after, even if he overwhelms me the first couple of times, I can't think what to answer, and I get taken aback. The thought will be constantly saying, but say it's supernatural, and force him to grant that, you see. And as long as you have that there in your mind, at some point, you'll have a chance to come out with it. And if you know the point, and if you've had enough experience, you'll be able to say it forcefully enough and turn the argument against him. But so in general, the advice I would give is don't try and answer the person on the terms that he puts forth. Now, you can't just evade what he says, because then it sounds like you're evading. But what you can do is say, I can discuss it on those terms because. And by the sheer fact of saying that, you disarm him and you try to get in your principle. That, I think, is the important point. What would be the application of this to another thing? Where the religious side, he made a very effective but completely irrelevant speech, but it was very effective nevertheless. Have you read the Bible? Did you read and so? Did you study this and this? And he gave a whole bunch of imposing titles, and it suggested that he has erudition, he has wisdom, he knows this inside out, and the poor atheist, in effect, is an ignoramus and has no business living if that's the state of his knowledge. Now, what should you do if you're in a situation like this and you're peppered with academic or scholastic lore of that kind, and you in fact haven't read it all? Now, the answer that was given is, well, I think you said I've read part of it or something, didn't you? So you kind of sort of swallowed it, and you suggested, well, it would be nice if I'd read all that, but I never got around to it. Now, what would be a more effective way? Don't lie. I suppose you haven't read any of it. Do you, in fact, have to have read any of it?
No, I did add that even though I've read those, I think I said that even though I read those things, that doesn't necessarily mean, not that that's a strong point again, but I said that doesn't necessarily mean, it can be fictional, it can be...
Yes, you did try to argue, well, these sources don't prove God anyway. But I'm speaking now on the aspect of he was obviously in a certain way trying to intimidate you, because he wasn't citing the evidence from these particular books or the alleged evidence. He was peppering you with titles. So he wanted you to feel, my God, I don't know what I'm talking about, and undercut you. Now, you have to have an instinct in argument. If someone is doing that to you, you have to come on strong in return. And if you haven't read it, what then do you do? I mean, if there's a certain, in effect, concession. If you say, well, I read part of it, it's like, well, he caught me. Only, if you haven't read it, turn your problem into an advantage by saying what in this case? Yes, yes. Well, one thing is to say, tell me what I missed, and that puts him in the position of having to defend that this is relevant. I would have a somewhat different instinct. Yes?
Return some cannonballs by citing your own sources and also cite that without going into a complete broad. But one example that comes to my mind is cite Thomas Paine's
Common sense. The Age of Reason. Yeah.
As being a pretty poor substantiation of the atheist case, but still...
No, but you're really conceding the point. You're saying recite your own barrage to show that you're really educated in your own literature, but then you're still conceding the point that in a philosophic argument on this kind of topic, the amount you've read is relevant, and in fact it is not relevant. To discuss the existence of God, it is entirely irrelevant to know the Bible, Anthony Flou's work, those other pamphlets and so on. It is completely unnecessary and useless because you're discussing a purely philosophic question. So what you have to do is take the offensive in such a case and say, what? Yes, at the back. Red hair, yes.
I would say, aha, that's why you're so misguided.
Now that's a better, yes, that's better. But there's an example, and I think it would be a good example of taking the offensive. He'd say, now I see why you're so misguided, if you're filled with all that stuff. Now that verges on a personal ad hominem, but it's not inappropriate because you're on the side of an attempt to be intimidated. But what you have to do is show you're not intimidated. And I would just have said something like, I haven't read any of it. Even if I had, I might tell him later I had it. My instinct would be to say, I never read any of it proudly because I don't read complete garbage. On this issue, there's no need to do any reading. This is clear cut. I don't spend my time studying werewolves and all the rest of it, and for the same reason I don't read all the maunderings on this subject. If you want to discuss the subject, let's hear it what you know, not these alleged authorities. You see, and that cuts out that. If, however, I put this in for accuracy, it should be the type of subject on which you should have read and you didn't know it, that is not an appropriate response then. That is then a counsel of desperation. But normally, in a philosophic issue, all of this is irrelevant, this type of reading. Now, what else more broadly did anyone have on the argument or on this general question of God? Yes, I'm sure you know the answer. Yes.
Would you say something about the etiquette or the morality of allowing somebody to interrupt you and yell over you and do this sort of thing that the...
Well, you say what I said something about the etiquette or morality of allowing somebody to interrupt you, yell over you, and so on. It's virtually impossible to avoid it in an argument because there's no structure, there's no organization, passions run high, neither side knows the other side's view, and therefore neither side listens to the other. Each is preparing his next statement as the one is talking, and as soon as you stop for breath, he rushes in because he's afraid too many points are going to come out. So it's almost impossible to have a decorous, polite, after you, Alphonse, you know. If someone, I would say this, if someone is interrupting as intimidation to prevent you from speaking, to sort of swamp you in sheer sound and brazenness, then you have to say, I'm sorry. You're not giving me a chance to speak. I won't talk under these conditions. I don't think that either did that in this debate. You think... Did you feel that you were not being given a chance to speak? That you were being cut off before?
I think I was thinking, trying to concentrate too much on what I was trying to say, and I wasn't really, as you say, I wasn't listening too closely to him. If I was, or if he was interrupting, it didn't come across to me.
But I felt that he was coming on a bit strong, the religious side, but not beyond the bounds of what would be normal in an argument. Yes. Well, he says he was trying to overwhelm him with so much verbiage that he wouldn't have a chance to figure out what to say, which is in effect in part what came about. In that case, you have to then draw a line. If you find you're being rushed to the point where you simply can't get your wits and you're losing point after point and you know you have answers but it's going by too fast, you have to say, stop. I can't argue this way. We either have to slow down and do it one point at a time or I'm out. Now, was there any, we have a couple minutes if you want to ask anything more generally about this question of God, or is this too elementary for this audience? Yes. I did have a question from someone weeks ago, I don't know if the person is still here, of what's the answer to who created the universe. And since that was one of the arguments used, is the person who asked that still here? Yeah. At the back?
Yes, the question.
Okay.
The question was essentially, the pro-God argument I've been hearing has been this, quote, you can't have a creation without a creator. Therefore, someone must have created all that exists. Therefore, there must be a God, unquote. How can this be refuted?
Very good. Let's repeat that so people can hear. The gentleman says the pro-God argument he has been hearing is, you can't have creation without a creator, which is certainly incontestable. And what was the next premise? The universe?
Therefore, someone must have created.
Oh, therefore someone must have created everything which exists, and the creator by definition is God, right? Okay. Now, he's suggesting this argument. You can't have creation without a creator. Therefore, someone must have created everything which exists. Now, how many think they can answer that argument? All right, let's hear what the answer is. Who wants to answer that? Yes.
He snuck in a premise that he didn't mention out loud, and that is he's assuming that the universe was created, or that the universe is a creation.
Yes, he says you omitted one premise before that argument follows. You can't have a creation without a creator. Next premise, the universe is a creation. Therefore, it must have a creator. But how do you establish that the universe must have is a creation? A creation in this sense means something which at one time didn't exist and which was brought into existence by some agency. How do you establish that? All we know by observation is that the universe is here. Therefore, if you want to establish that there must have been some period when it wasn't, that preceded its existence and that it was then brought into existence, the fact of its present existence does not tend to establish that. Now, of course, beyond that, if you go into the objectivist view, you could then say what? The whole idea of a creation of the universe is an inherent contradiction. Why? Yes. Well, you take, because an infinite regress simply illustrates, because who created the creator and so on and so on. So at some point you say something had to exist all the time, and if something, why not the universe that you start with rather than a mythical one that you invent, and then repose the same problem on that level. But more basically, the answer is the universe means the sum of that which is. So there can be, by definition, nothing beyond the sum of that which is. If it's outside of that which is, then as Parmenides pointed out, in the ancient world there's only one definition for it. That which isn't. And that's the atheist viewpoint. And so the argument from creation, the Greeks were better in this respect. Many of them believed in God, but they never tried to show that God created the universe out of nothing, ex nihilo. They simply tried to show that he ordered or designed the universe, made it behave in an orderly way, but they believed that the substance of the universe always existed. And that is a superior position to the Judeo-Christian one, simply because it recognizes that existence as such always existed. Of course, that also is fallacious. Yes?
The thing that helped me most with that, though, is to realize that time is dependent on existence and not outside it. So when you're talking about existence always existed or what happened before that, time is a concept that comes.
Yes. Yes. Time is an attribute, a relationship within existence. So you can't talk about the time before the universe. Yes.
Well, I asked that question in Catholic high school, and I was told God created time, so it didn't make any sense.
Well, if he created the universe, you say you were told in school that God created time, so it didn't make any difference. Well, that's true. If he created the universe, he would create all relationships in it. But then presumably he did not create time on Tuesday. Actually, by way of I was trying to think of this issue. There's really only three main arguments of an enduring kind that have ever been offered, beyond polemics and esoterica and the Dead Sea Scroll type of argument. The only three really enduring arguments for God that have gone along. One is the argument from creation. One is the argument from design, the idea that how come the universe is so orderly, for which, of course, the objectivist view is that cause and effect is inherent in existence. So if existence is a primary, so is the law of cause and effect and therefore order. And the third essential argument for God is, in Dostoevsky, a religious argument of morality. Where would morality come from if there was no God? How would you know what is good and evil, right and wrong? And you know the Dostoevsky line, anything would be permitted if there was no God. And that, of course, is what we call the primacy of consciousness applied to morality, that morality is an arbitrary revelation of a consciousness, that there's nothing in reality itself which would require man to live according to certain principles, and therefore if you took away a supernatural consciousness, there'd be no basis for morality. And you know, of course, the essential objectivist view on that question is that morality is objective, that it is therefore inherent, and the need of it is inherent in the requirements of human life. Now you will say, but can anything be objective? Is objective knowledge possible? And that would be a good transition to our next debate. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us now have one final sample argument to conclude our discussion of arguing for purposes of this course. The subject of this one is objectivity. is objective knowledge possible or not? Miss Denise Chalky on my right is going to be taking the pro-objectivity side, and I am going to take the other side. But as I told her, it would not be right to do this in an attempt to overwhelm her with a whole bunch of jargon or anything, and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be, I think, much more polite than the opponents of objectivity would normally be, but actually I've made a list of what I think are the main kinds of arguments you would get against the possibility of objectivity, and at one point or another I'm just going to quietly, I hope, deliver them and see how Ms. Chalky does with regard to them. Okay, do you want to come up here? Turn on your... And whenever you're ready, have you got water?
Yes, I have.
Okay, then you tell me. Oh, I have to pick this up. Okay.
Okay. Not only is objective knowledge possible, but it is the only type of knowledge possible.
You're reading a speech to me.
No,
right?
no.
Just your opening statement.
Yeah.
Oh, but thereafter it's going to be...
Yes,
all
yes.
Right, okay.
If something is to be called knowledge, it must, by necessity, be objective. That is, it must be based on the facts of reality, or it must be in accordance with the facts of reality.
Let me interrupt here because it's too much for me to hold. And if we were having an argument, I would jump right in here and say, you say there has to be objectivity if there's to be knowledge.
Yes,
correct?
correct.
Well, but maybe that's true, but then is there knowledge? The thing that strikes me is that there's so much disagreement among people. You say something, you think it's obvious, and other people disagree with it, so how can you say when you know?
Well, the fact that you ask, is there knowledge, is a contradiction. The question, is there knowledge, is a contradiction. Because for you to ask that question, you must have acquired knowledge before.
What knowledge would I have to have acquired? Yes.
Knowledge of the concept knowledge, to begin with.
I'd have to have I have to know the word, that's true. So I have to know, I grant this much, I have to know certain words in order to speak. Or to be more exact, I have to have learned, how people use the word. Would you call that knowledge?
Well, if you...
That's linguistic skill I have to acquire.
Well, are all words then empty, no meaning?
Well, people use words, so I guess they mean something. Yeah, sure.
Don't they have a reference in reality?
Well, I don't know where the reference are. I mean, they stand for something. But they stand, in effect, for what people mean by them, whatever people say they mean. I mean, look, something like book could mean anything, but people just arbitrarily decide what it's going to be used for, right?
Well, the sound, yes. The sound of the concept is maybe arbitrarily chosen, but the concept book is not arbitrary.
Well, what distinction do you make between the word and the concept?
Well, the word stands for the concept.
What is the concept as apart from the word?
The concept is an abstract concept that stands for things in reality.
I'll pass by that it's circular because you define a concept.
Yes, it is.
It's an abstraction that stands for things in reality. Well, like, for instance, every concept stands for something in reality?
Yes.
Like gremlin?
Gremlin is not a concept. I don't know what it is.
Oh, it's a little green.
A little green what?
All right. Why do I have to acquire knowledge, objective knowledge, to have these concepts again? Tell me that. I didn't see that.
There is no such thing as non-objective knowledge. Non-objective knowledge is a contradiction in terms.
All right. Why is it a contradiction?
Because when you say I have knowledge, you have to be conscious of something.
Have to be conscious of something.
Yeah, knowledge is to be conscious of something.
Okay.
And
but what if people are conscious of different things, though? You know, so I, for instance, think that...
You have different knowledge.
Well, but then how can we say it's subjective if everybody disagrees? That's where I start.
Because precisely, it has to be based on reality, to be an objective concept or to have objective knowledge.
It has to be based on reality. So if
Correct.
people disagree, then one of them is not based on reality?
Yes, if there is a disagreement, not both can be true at the same time.
So anytime two people disagree, one is wrong?
Correct.
On any question?
On any question.
So for instance, I like cherry pie, and Mr. X does not. So we disagree then, and therefore
You disagree,
one of us is wrong?
You disagree on those matters are matters of taste, but if you tell me, for example,
so is
this-
that
this
subjective?
cherry- this cherry-
Is that subjective, just that one part?
a matter of taste?
Yes.
Yes, I think.
So then whether we like cherry pie or not, I win on that point then, right?
Yes, but that's your evaluation.
Oh, that's because that's an evaluation.
Yeah.
So could we say then evaluations are subjective, whereas facts are objective?
On matters of taste, like liking cake or not, yes.
Well, would it go to ice cream?
Ice cream, yes. I'll
What
taste
about,
of
what about sexual practices?
I don't know about that. I'm really.
So that's a question.
I haven't had that kind of experience.
What about basic moral principles, like you should
Yes.
tell the truth?
Yes.
That's subject.
No, objective.
Oh, that's object.
Yeah.
So in other words, then there's values that are objective and values that are subjective.
No, matters of taste, like liking cake or pie.
Well, what is the difference
there's-
between them and the others?
Because when you evaluate a moral action, there is an objective standard. But if you happen to like cake, there's no objective standard.
Okay, well then, according to you, we need an objective standard to have objective knowledge, and the objective standard, if I understand you, has to be reality, right?
Yes,
What is
correct.
reality? Is it reality
can't-
that I like cake? That's real.
You're asking me what is reality?
Yeah.
I cannot define that. Reality is the same as existence. Are you using both terms equivalent?
Well, I don't know. Are you?
Yeah, I am.
Yes.
Yes.
So reality is the same as existence.
Yes.
So then objective knowledge has to be knowledge based on it.
On existence.
Well, what is existence?
I can't define that.
Do you have any
I'll-
contact with it?
Yes.
In what way?
When you ask me to define existence, I'd like to quote Miss Rand.
All right.
in
It's
her,
a short quote?
A short quote, yes.
Go ahead.
She says to define existence, one would have to sweep one's arms around and say, I mean this.
I see. In other words, all right.
There's only an ostensive type of
And
definition.
by ostensive, you point to
Yes,
it.
you
It's
point.
everything
Yeah,
out there.
yeah,
Right.
correct.
All right. So let's say I don't challenge that much. There's something out there. But now, according to you, knowledge is based on what's out there, right?
Correct.
But how do we get this objective knowledge since people disagree about so many things? We all are in contact with what's out there, aren't we, or not?
Yes, but you're not guaranteed to know. You can't guarantee a correct knowledge of reality.
Well,
The
does
only-
that mean that any given piece of knowledge might be wrong?
Correct, yes.
Well, then we can never say about any claim this is the objective truth because it might be wrong.
No, because
No.
there are methods to validate your knowledge.
What are the methods?
Logic is the
Then
method.
any logical argument, the conclusion is acceptable.
Any logical argument, if you check the premises also,
On the premises
are true.
from, and how do you establish that?
You compare it to reality.
Well,
You
that's
see
how
if
we
it-
started originally, and you said, but I can only compare by the use of logic.
By the use of reason.
Is reason and logic the same thing?
No, it's not. Reason is your faculty of perceiving reality, of And logic is the method you use.
All right, let's be specific. The Mideast is a reality, right?
Correct.
Now, some people say that the Shah should have had haven in the United States, and other people say he shouldn't. Now, they both perceive the Shah, or pictures of him on TV, and they perceive, the newscast and so on. Now, how would you resolve this if knowledge is objective? Presumably, there's a right and a wrong here. How would you go about resolving? Or is that like cherry pie?
No, it's not.
All right. So how would you decide?
Well, you would have to, first of all, check all the facts, why people believe he should not have been.
You'd have to check the facts, why they believe.
Why they believe that he shouldn't have come here?
They say, some of them say he shouldn't have come here because they risk the chance of American reprisals against the United States, which happened. So.
Yeah. So how do you check if it's...
Well, that was true. There was reprisals. There were hostages taken. So does that make their viewpoint objective?
No.
Well, they checked it against the facts.
No.
What?
You have to, first of all, check the reasons why they let the Shah in.
Why did they let the Shah in?
Why they let the Shah in?
The actual reason they let it in, according to what I read in the Times, was because Kissinger and a few other people phoned the White House.
Okay, but was it correct? Was it correct?
Well, you asked me was it correct, but that's the whole question. I'm trying to say that people who question objectivity would say they could study all the facts, and one thinks one thing and one thinks the opposite, and there's no way to resolve it. So how can we say there's an objective answer?
But there is an objective answer.
What's the objective answer?
I can't tell you. I have to check all the facts.
But you don't yourself know what it is.
No, I don't know.
Well, give me an objective fact that you yourself actually know.
This table exists.
Such as the time, for instance. Yes.
This table exists.
This table exists here.
Yes.
This is a fact that you actually know.
Yes.
How do you know?
Because I perceive it, I see it, I can touch it.
But you know that people's sensory experience varies enormously, right? I mean, some people see one color, some see another. Some people are colorblind, some people are completely blind. You know the thing about if you put your hand in water when it's hot, and it feels cool, and when it's cold, it feels warm, and the same thing feels different to different people. And dogs would see, cats see in black and white, etc., and therefore, how do you know any of these? If the senses are our basic tie to reality.
But your senses can't go wrong. They have no choice.
Okay, but maybe my senses have no choice but to tell me fact A, and yours have no choice but to tell you fact non-A. So we have a contradiction.
No.
No? Why?
Because your senses perceive that which exists, and existence is absolute. I mean, you can't perceive.
Well, but if we disagree, do people ever disagree?
Yes, people
about the senses. About the sensory evidence.
About what they perceive?
Yes.
Yes, but their error is conceptual, not.
But then they're not actually disagreeing about what they perceive.
For example, give me an example.
Well, okay. If I look at this and see it's yellow, and a colorblind person looks and sees it's gray, are we disagreeing? He says it's gray, and I say it's yellow.
Yes, both are correct in that case.
Both.
Yes, both are correct in that case.
Right. How is that?
Because the color-blind person, it's true that he sees this tablecloth gray,
right.
But
what is it really?
It's really yellow. The guy.
Oh, well, but if his senses can then give it to him wrong,
but his senses are not normal to begin with.
Oh, and what is normal?
Normal is
majority.
In the case of seeing, you mean?
Yes, in the case of the senses.
Yeah, it's normal for man to see
but what
different colors.
How do we decide what's normal?
Because he's colorblind, you're already calling him blind, right? Not
That's
normal.
Right. He definitely has a different form of experience in that area. But is there anything against him besides the fact that he's in a minority?
That he's not normal, that's it.
Well, but then if we could do that, why can't we do the same thing on the level of abstract ideas? And for instance, say, well, most people believe so-and-so about the Shah, so if you don't, you're not normal.
No.
Why?
Not normal, no, but wrong, yes.
Well, why do we make that distinction with regard to the senses and not with regard to ideas?
You see, in the case of the colorblind person, he is not actually seeing. He is not.
Just so you can be heard, yes.
He is not.
Are his senses actually wrong in that
Yeah,
case?
his senses are not normal. They're incapable of perceiving the tablecloth as yellow.
Okay, well, I won't press the senses further, but I'll just indicate on the side here that if you take that line, you're going to be in hard shape to defend objectivity, but we'll elaborate that further. Let us just go on to one other point here. What do you say about this point, which I commonly hear? If you say we have to go by the facts of reality,
yes,
and to get objective knowledge, but after all, reality is enormously complicated. There's millions of facts, so we can't possibly go through everything. Therefore, we have to select what facts we're going to take as the decisive facts in any given situation. I mean, for instance, we could just write a biography of the Shah. It could go on 100 pages, 1,000 pages. So we have to decide what is the essentials and what aren't. And in essence, everybody selects differently. And you have to have some means of selection, and it can't be a fact that tells you how to select, because that's what's helping you to figure out what the facts are. Therefore, you have to choose subjectively. And therefore, all knowledge is subjective, because the facts that you use are chosen by a subjective process. I hear that all the time.
No, they are not. When you arrive at a conclusion, you have to check all the facts relevant to that conclusion, all the facts that you know.
Right.
And if you've checked all the facts that you know, and it leads you to that conclusion, then it's objective.
But you have to decide which facts are essential, right?
Yes.
And how do you do that? Isn't that subjective?
No, why do you say that?
Well, I mean, all the facts are all just there. And yet we're saying this particular fact is really crucial, and this one isn't so important.
Yeah, well,
why do we discriminate?
You discriminate.
How do we?
You discriminate in relation to the other facts. You can't just take one fact and say this is the most fundamental fact, and forget about
how? Explain to me how in relation to the other fact.
For example, you say, okay, I'll take man's most fundamental characteristic. And let's say he walks on two legs, he has two eyes, he has a nose,
right,
and he's rational. And he builds skyscrapers, and he
all right, so you give
speaks,
a whole catalog,
correct.
Right, yes.
So you select the fact that is most fundamental, that implies most of the rest, that makes the other ones possible, and that is rationality.
Case, right. So you're saying that in effect the same pattern that would be used with regard to choosing essentials in regard to a definition would be applicable more broadly in any type of discussion.
Yeah, I think so.
So then let me see if I summarize it. You say that objective knowledge is possible based on facts, that we have access to the facts by the senses, but that in some cases the senses are wrong, but that's a minority who is abnormal, but the rest it's okay. And that when we get to the level of concepts, we can be objective if we use reason or logic.
Both.
Both?
Yes.
What would be an example of using reason but not logic?
Okay. Because logic is a method of
right. So whenever you use logic, you're using reason.
Okay, fine.
But we have to do it in terms of essentials. And if we do, we'll find that all the conclusions we come to except certain things, which are matters of taste.
Yes.
Okay? All right, I'll let you go with that.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Now, it's a little hard for me to keep in mind the points to comment on and take part in it at the same time. I think, obviously, that Ms. Chalky did very well under what was enormous provocation, because I was here pouring the stuff at her like a real inquisitor, which I didn't really intend to do. So she had a very unpleasant, tricky thing, and I think she did extremely well. So I'd like a hand of appreciation to her. My main concern, which she very much helped to illustrate, was simply to demonstrate to you that if you want to defend such a thing as objectivity of knowledge, you ultimately have to be able to do what? And it comes out within what, 5 or 10 minutes. What is it that emerges as the main point in terms of the substance of the argument? Yes?
What about the dependability of the senses?
Well, the dependability of the senses is only one, but more broadly, what is the name of what came up? Yes? You have to cover epistemology and really metaphysics to defend and what else? Because the issue of values came up, right? So you have to be able to cover the essentials of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. It's an enormously philosophic topic. You see, that's the reason why objectivism is called objectivism, because that concept is central in every branch. In metaphysics, it stands for the idea that there is a reality that exists independent of us. In epistemology, it stands for the fact that we can acquire knowledge of things as they are, not influenced by our arbitrary feelings. And in ethics, it stands for the idea that objective value judgments are possible. Since it has roots in all these branches, as soon as you defend the objectivity of knowledge, you open up everything. The means of knowledge, which is the senses and logic and reason and concepts, and the object of knowledge, which is reality, and the various applications of knowledge, including value judgments and even political examples and gastronomic examples. And consequently, it is, I chose it deliberately to show you a completely non-self-contained issue. God is much easier to argue, you see, because it's one specific thing. Or even capitalism is much easier. But here you are in a very proliferating question that goes throughout everything, and therefore you have to be up on everything, because the subject will change at any moment into another main, and they are essentials, you see, they're not just arbitrary. Now, we'll take a moment while you see if you can make a list of what you think were the significant points, pro or con, in Ms. Chalky's answers. All right, now which points do you think that she answered correctly or well, convincingly? By a show of hands, I'll take anybody who, because she did definitely answer several. Yes?
The point on how you narrowed down the field of all the relevant knowledge using definitions.
You say when I was giving the argument about things that are so complicated, how do you know what facts are relevant? She was up on the objectivist theory of what is an essential. Now, you see, it's a very tricky kind of discussion, because to present what is an essential, and normally it's abstract, it's a very abstract discussion, and it's lengthy, and the other person would interrupt and say, why do you think, what is rationality, and why is that more important than building a building, and you'd get off and off. But I let her go on that, but she did have the general idea. Whereas, you see, if you didn't know the objectivist theory of definition, you'll be completely stopped on that point. So I simply went into that to indicate to you all of these things which you see here as part of a lecture on epistemology or a course on it are put there for a definite reason. It's not only polemical, of course, to answer arguments, but it's because in the logic of the subject you cannot discuss those things without knowing those. And I thought she did that one reasonably well within the context of what could be done. That's used very commonly, by news people. That objectivity isn't possible because there's so many facts, and you have to choose which ones do you choose. And of course the answer has to be you choose in terms of essentials, but then you have to be able to say what are essentials. It's not a full answer simply to say what are essentials in terms of definitions. That would be the beginning. Then you'd have to show how that applies to selecting essentials in the context of news gathering or passing value judgments and so on. I obviously didn't pursue that because that would be a whole evening's discussion. But if you did apply it appropriately, what you started by saying, that would be okay. So that you had a reasonable answer to that. What do you think of her answer when I said, but people disagree? Which I hammered several times because that is really the main thing that unphilosophical people say. They take the idea, well, if everybody agreed, there'd be no problem. But since people disagree, how can you say he has the truth and she doesn't? How would you answer that one specific point? Or what do you think of her answer, Mr. Schwartz?
Well, she could take the offensive and say, what are you trying to establish by this agreement? Or just simply point out that knowledge is individual and all it takes one.
Well, you say she could either take the offensive and say, what are you trying to establish by that, or she could point out that knowledge is individual, it only takes one. But what did she actually do on that? She said, well, if people disagree, one is wrong. Could she have said a bit more on that?
At least one is wrong. Maybe one of them is wrong.
Say again?
She would say, well, which one is corresponding to the facts?
She could have said a bit more about repudiating that as a criterion. You could have said, I make a big difference. You see, it's an issue of emphasis. If you see that your opponent is very hard on one point with which you disagree, it's always helpful to state openly, this is a big point of dispute between us, I reject that, rather than just answering it, because sometimes you might answer and he doesn't grasp that you really reject this whole approach, and so he keeps pressing and pressing. Whereas if you say, look, agreement and disagreement is an entirely different question. That may be relevant to taking public polls. But we're not taking polls, we're talking about knowledge. Even if everybody agreed, I wouldn't accept that as evidence that the idea in question is objective, because maybe they all agree on a falsehood. So let's throw out the question whether they agree or disagree, and let's talk about the question, are they attuned to the facts or not? I regard it as irrelevant that they disagree. Now, if you said that firmly, even more briefly than I just said it, but you made a point of repudiating that, then it stops me. Then I lose that string to my bow, so to speak. I can't keep coming back. Whereas the way you did it, you in effect said, well, if people disagree, one is wrong, but you didn't, you see the difference? You didn't make a little stress that I can completely repudiate that approach. And therefore, you did repudiate it, but not emphatically enough to scare me off from coming back to it over and again. It's an issue just of a little bit more emphasis, and again, it's an issue of asserting your terms, feeling free in an argument to get your terms in and not just go right on the defense. And now I know it's an impossible experience when you're doing it with the lecturer and so on, so I'm not in any way criticizing. I couldn't, I'm sure, have done that well in your case under equivalent circumstances, but I'm just saying it in general for purposes of the future. What other comments now on the content of the answers? Because there's a couple of points here you'd have to check, otherwise you'd get into some difficulty. Let's take the one, yes. Yeah.
On the cherry pie thing.
Oh, the cherry pie, all right. Take.
You said that was subjective, and what I would say is, it's a fact, some people like cherry pie. It's a fact, some people don't like cherry pie. And both those facts are objective.
Well, you could certainly say that. You say it's a fact some people like cherry pie, that's objective. And it's a fact some people don't, that's subjective. So both are objective facts. But is there a disagreement between those two people?
I'd say not, because it's true.
There's no disagreement between those two.
It's true that I dislike cherry pie, and it's true that Leonard Peikoff likes cherry pie, and that's what the truth is, and we both agree.
Well, let's see. You say the truth is you like it and I don't like it, so both statements are true, so there's no disagreement. Well, could we apply that to, for instance, you like murder and I don't? Therefore, there's no disagreement. No one ever disagrees about anything, because all we do is talk about our own feelings. But that means you would save objectivity at the price of saying that all we can be objective about is describing our own subjective feelings. And that is a fairly drastic surgery. I mean, I think you have to get around the cherry pie some other way. You have to make some it's true what you're saying. We're not, in fact, disagreeing. But you have to say something more to separate out those tastes which you're not talking about from those moral values which you are. And what is the obvious thing in the case of the cherry pie, which takes it out of the realm of argument or discussion or debate or whichever? I'll give somebody else a chance here. Who else? Somebody? Yes.
It's a moral decision. It's not a decision that relates to morality.
You say it's amoral. It doesn't relate to morality. Well, why doesn't it?
The fact that you do or don't does not make any difference.
You say the fact doesn't make any difference. Well, to whom? To cherry pie bakers, it may make a difference.
The guy who likes.
No, there's a certain difference. There's a certain other kind of difference, a much bigger difference between for instance, the cherry pie question and the question of telling the truth or committing murder. What is the difference? Why would you say in one case the difference of taste varies from person to person? There are several crucial differences between them. Yes?
In the case of the cherry pie, no one is arguing that the other person ought to like cherry pie. Whereas with the case with murder or telling the truth, the person arguing is saying that murder is wrong for everybody.
Well, you're saying that in the case of the cherry pie, you deliberately restrict the judgment to yourself. You don't try to universalize it or make it mandatory on others. But the question is, what is the difference why you're entitled to do that on the pie and not on the murder case? Why shouldn't you say about pie, well, if it's good, it's objectively good, and therefore everybody should love it?
Well, when you use the term good, it's not used in the same sense. The good with cherry pie means that it appeals to certain taste buds.
Well, here the actual thing is the buds, the taste buds. In other words, the value is determined primarily, or in one essential way, by physiological sensation. It's not a conceptual issue. You don't arrive at, basically, your response to cherry pie by means of thought, analysis, conceptualization, and intellectual decision or philosophy, but just by exposing something to your tongue and having a certain chemical or physiological reaction. And in that sense, obviously, the sensation would vary from person to person, and different types of tongue with different viscosity of the saliva and so on and so on. So would end in different kinds of sweetness or bitterness, etc. There may also be an associational element. We know whether you first had cherry pie at a wonderful romantic evening or, in a cellar crawling with snakes or something, and what you associate with it, which is, again, simply a perceptual or accidental issue. So that on both those counts, it would be objectively essentially different from what it would be if you ask a question, should you tell the truth or should you respect another person's life, where it's in no sense a matter of association or of physiology, where you have to define the question, you have a choice, and it's something you have to decide by conceptual means. You'd have to be able, you see, to make that kind of distinction. Otherwise, and know where you draw the line, as in the case of sex, for instance, what you're going to include, what's objective and what isn't, and be able to explain what principles are objective and where you think there are options. That's a point you would have to know, and it's very important when you're discussing objectivity, because after all, there are optional things in life. The optional is not the same as the subjective. If you know objectivism, you know that there are areas where there are many different legitimate choices within the same objective principle. And that's a distinction that would be important for you to be able to master and explain, because most people arguing for the idea that if any two people have any difference among them and everything is objective, then one of them must be wrong. And that entirely ignores the legitimate role of options. For instance, a productive career is an objective need of human life, and you can prove that. But it's optional whether you become a pharmacist or a doctor or a lawyer or architect or whatever particular form you give to that. You could not say one of those is objectively superior to the other, nor does it mean that the choice is subjective, because there's no reason that one should be preferred to the other. So you'd say it's a legitimate optional choice within the framework of an objective principle, and therefore the choice is objective, whichever one of the various possibilities it is. When would it become subjective? If you put bank robbing in as one of your options, because that violates the actual principle of a productive career. Now, you'd have to be able to cover this type of point and know what you would take as optional and what not. Otherwise, the advocate of subjectivity will seize that this is one common strategy on some legitimate option, like cherry pie or whichever, which is not a philosophic issue, which doesn't prove anything, and then force you into, well, if there, then you're saying only some things are objective, and where do you draw the line? And while you hem and haw, he's gone to town. So that's one point where you could tighten up your point. Now, the other main point that I remember was on the issue of the senses. What was the point there? Yes.
She said that if someone's colorblind, that would be an abnormal sense perception, and therefore sensing the yellow cloth as gray as an error.
Yes, you said or implied that sensing that the colorblind person sensing the yellow cloth as gray would be committing an error, that this was abnormal. It is, of course, abnormal, but you implied that that would make him mistaken. And as soon as you do that, you're in very bad shape, because you are then establishing the principle that it is possible for sensory data to be wrong under certain conditions. Now, if the senses, the actual data that you get from the senses can be wrong, you're wide open to what kind of objection? You had no choice about that data. Remember, your choice comes only in conceptualizing. If the actual data itself can be mistaken, then what objection are you immediately vulnerable to? Yes. Who's to say when the senses are telling the truth and when they're not? We have no choice about it, and yet they can deceive us in certain cases. They can go wrong. Now, it's not sufficient to say it's abnormal, because then the question becomes, what is the criterion of abnormality? It can't be simply numerical. And then you leave open the question, suppose another species is discovered, you know, on another planet or something. And there are many more of them than us, and they all have that structure, and they all see it in shades of gray. It can't be a quantitative issue, you see. So what you have to make a sharp line in defending cognitive questions between what the senses contribute and what the concepts, the conceptual level does. And you have to hold out firmly for the idea the senses per se cannot be wrong, not even the colorblind man's perceptions. And I won't go into that at length, but in a word, why is that so? Why is it not wrong to see that table as gray, as dark gray, say, or whichever? That is not an error, now I'm giving the objectivist viewpoint on this, obviously. And on this point, we actually disagree with Aristotle. But he had trouble with the senses for this reason, among others. Why is it not wrong to say this table, to perceive this table as gray? Yes, in the front.
It's still the same table, though the form may vary.
All that is changing is the form of the perception. The basic objectivist point is all sensation has to be in some form. And the nature of that form depends in part on your sensory apparatus. So if your apparatus changes in some way, the rods and the cones in the eye in this case, the experience will change. But that doesn't disqualify any experience. You always perceive somehow, but the role of experience is the raw data which we then conceptualize. And in this case, if we don't see color differences, we simply don't get directly certain kinds of distinctions which we have to reach by inference from the senses that we do have. So that colorblind people still end up with the same physics, the same understanding of reality that ordinary sighted people have. It's simply a difference in the amount of information they're given directly by the eyes and in the form of that information. But you see, you want to avoid ever suggesting that the senses can go wrong, even in cases of so-called abnormal perception. If it's actually perception, that's it. That's it as perceived by human consciousness. by the consciousness with those particular organs. Then the question becomes how to interpret it, how to explain it, and so on. And that becomes a conceptual question. Now, the real issue then, I covered just these two sidelines, which I remember that you were somewhat off on, but the real issue then is when you get to the conceptual level. To establish objectivity, you have to show them that the senses are reliable if they challenge it, right? And you have to be prepared to separate out the optional from what you really want to defend. But the real thing comes in the conceptual level, because that's really what the whole debate is about. And what is it, in effect, you have to be able to do in such a case? Which I was doing the deliberate opposite to see if I could provoke you into saying what was needed, and I didn't quite. What was at the very beginning, when you were trying to say to me, there can't be knowledge if it isn't objective? And I said, well, it's simply the use of words. Well, what is the issue there that I was trying to get at? That is the issue on which really the objectivity of knowledge depends, at the back.
That it's metaphysical issue. That it's based on a recognition of things that are out there in reality.
That it's based on reality is not the point I mentioned. That, of course, is inherent in being objective. But what is the main trap why people don't see that? The main thing that prevents them from grasping the objectivity of knowledge. It's not really the senses, and it's not cherry pie. Those are distracting things that are associated with the debate for a long time. But what is the real central issue that causes so much trouble on this question? Yes?
Well, men passionately disagree in their views. They seem to be honest and offer very good arguments.
Well, the disagreement is one thing, but that, you say people passionately disagree and seem to offer good arguments, so people just conclude you can't know anything. That in itself wouldn't do it, though, because there's another obvious response to disagreement, which is the one that she gave. If somebody is wrong, let's analyze the logic. But why do people feel in advance, oh, it's hopeless. However much we analyze, we're all going to disagree anywhere, and therefore it's all just a matter of opinion. What is the actual idea that maybe most people couldn't articulate, but the view that they've absorbed, which makes them feel it's hopeless and it's all a matter of opinion? Yes?
Whether or not their concepts refer to something outside.
Yes, it's the issue of concepts, whether concepts are objective. But the way most people would experience it is not concepts, but in their minds it would be words. The main thing you have to hit or discuss, if you're discussing objectivity, the main thing, which I didn't want to push that too much here because that would start a long, heavy discussion, but the main thing is to get across to the person how you use words is not arbitrary. That you take the view that every word has to be formed by a definite method. It has to be based on a certain definite kind of fact. It has to be used and defined a certain way. And therefore, before you can discuss any other questions, you have to agree on how you're going to use words, which means concepts. Now, if you know that area and you know how to argue that point, and the person is at all decent, they'll get a glimmer that there's something more basic than all these superficial disagreements, and that is, he is simply assuming anybody can put words together and use them in any way he wants, and therefore anybody can say anything. But actually the debate is much more fundamental. Is there some rules by which language has to be formed and used or not? Now, you have to ask the person in effect in those terms if you're defending objectivity. Do you or do you not recognize some terms which have to be adhered to in the use of language? And then if the person will, in effect, ultimately is going to say yes or no. If he says no, there's no method of using it, period. It's anybody can say anything. That obviously wipes out any discussion. You can just say, ish to triddle to gloop, and he says, what's that? And you say, that's the definitive refutation of you, and that's the way I'm using words. That's it. You can't go any further. But if he's an honest person, he may be intrigued, especially if he does not know philosophy. He'll say, well, what would be a rule of using words? I don't have any idea. Then you have to tell him words are concepts, and read this book. and go from there. But then it becomes, you see, really comes down to an issue of concepts. That if you can get the person to grasp that much, that will be the revelation that will, in time, enable you to get somewhere. Now, I don't hold out a great hope for that in a drawing room discussion, but if you're serious on trying to convince someone of the possibility of objectivity, nothing less would do it, because that is the real problem, that people don't grasp the objectivity of concepts. They don't even grasp the terms of that problem. They just think, oh, it's all semantics or it's all words, and therefore the whole thing just floats. Do I have any questions or comments on this now, either the argument or the wider subject, before we take a break and go to questions in general? Yes?
Didn't she make you contradict yourself when she pretended not to know what a gremlin was, and you had to refer your knowledge of gremlins?
Didn't she make me contradict myself? Yes, I evaded minorly a few times. She said, do you know what's a gremlin? And I said, a little green, and stopped. See, and she didn't make me continue, but you were implying I contradicted myself because I said use of words did not imply any knowledge, and then I said what I knew. Now, you see, if she had pressed that point harder, she could have come to the idea that, which is what she started, but I derailed her, that words involve knowledge, and therefore certain methods of using them. And therefore, as soon as I said gremlin, that would be the point to say, look, that's exactly what the whole issue relies on. You think you can just take a word and utter it without any basis at all, and that's exactly what our whole debate is over. Now, if she had done that to me, as an advocate of subjectivity, I'd begin to feel uncomfortable. So I feel I'm doing something arbitrary, and she won't let me do it, you know. Of course, there'd still be a lot of, this is a long, long argument, because it involves a whole philosophy, really. But that would have been one way to get into it, and I wriggled out of it. But that's one of the techniques of argument, is to know when not to let the person wriggle out. Yes?
She did say a green wad. You said a green, and she said a green wad.
Did she say a green wad when and then what did I say to that? Oh, I just avoided. Well, that's normally what you would get. Right. So that was naturalistic in that regard. Yes?
I'm wondering about what the implications are for is objectivity possible? Does it mean in the extreme that when two people who presumably are blessed with an objective approach try to reach a conclusion, that they must of necessity come to the same precise conclusion, because
well, let's stop there, because I can only repeat so much, and I think I understand the question. The gentleman is asking, what are the implications of saying that objectivity is possible? Does it mean that two people, if they are both being objective, will necessarily end up on discussing some question with the precise same conclusion? You asking me what I would say about that? If you put enough stress on the word "and," I would say yes, it does mean that. Does it mean that they will end with the same conclusion? Yes, in time, but because A is A, and assuming here we're not talking about cherry pie or questions of optional personal taste of a physiological kind, but you're talking about some substantive question about the world. I would say two people who use an objective method, however far apart they start, if they're both honest, will ultimately have to agree, ultimately, because they're talking about the same reality. The fact is what it is. Both of them are using the same method of processing it. So the only differences, the only source of differences can be twofold. One is they start from different points. And if they're both objective, your original starting points themselves have to be validated, ultimately, by reduction back to sensory basis. So they would have to then identify, in that case, what are the differences between them, and resolve the dispute on that level. And or there is some difference in the reasoning, in which case one or the other is, or both conceivably, are making unwarranted inferences which they then would have to scrutinize. Perhaps the facts are, for some long period of time, so ambiguous, so confusing, that there really is no way to come to a firm judgment. In such a case, two objective people can definitely differ for a protracted period, but then they have to qualify their difference by saying they have different hypotheses. In the commonest case, that is, they couldn't claim knowledge, you see, but the commonest example of that is in judging people's characters. One of the very hardest things to do is come to an objective judgment about another person's character, because it's so hard to know. There are so many possible interpretations of a given action. And therefore, you can have a very mixed picture about another person, mixed in the sense that there are some signs you think are really good and some signs you think aren't so good, and some that you don't know exactly what they mean, and you just can't put it together. And two honest people using an objective approach and trying to be completely factual could say, one could say, well, look, if he did so and so, I don't care what else you say about him, I really think there has to be something bad about him. And the other person would say, well, look, but he also did so and so, and in the light of that, how can you not say there's something good about him? Now, I've seen that kind of debate many times, and I've been in many times in the situation where I simply could not choose between the two, and I would classify it in my own mind as there's two different hypotheses. There's very little known about that field, so there isn't even, that is about causes of character and the different interpretations and so on. So there isn't even a method of knowing exactly how much to apportion, in many cases, how much weight to give to a given evidence. And so you could say, my hypothesis, based on so-and-so, is that the person is basically bad or good, or I don't know. And we might say, well, let's agree to disagree, but you'd have to make this distinction. You'd have to know you can't prove it. This is your hypothesis in a mixed or confused situation. If one person, however, claimed to be able to prove it objectively, then it should be the kind of proof that would convince any honest person in time. And in that sense, they would end up in complete agreement. Now, maybe on any given person's character, they'll never end up in agreement because they'll die before the evidence is all in. But leaving aside that type of thing, ultimately, there should be no disagreement on factual questions, or certainly not on philosophical questions, because all of them are resolved by reference to reality according to a certain method. And that method itself is the province of epistemology to validate objectively. And therefore, there should be ultimately no disagreement on those type of questions. Anything else on objectivity? For or against? Yes?
I'm not even sure I can put the question. I'm just not clear on cherry pie. Are you saying that the statement, you like cherry pie, I don't, that those statements are within the category of objectivity, but they are optional?
I would say, with regard to your preference in cherry pie, it is not a cognitive issue per se, and therefore it's really outside the question of objective versus subjective. It's not a conceptual issue. What is conceptual is your grasp of whether you like it or not. But it's the same thing as red, in what way we would say a sensation is not objective or subjective. It simply is. Objective versus subjective are terms that apply only on the conceptual level, where you have to abstract and go through a complex mental process to come to a certain conclusion. Now, in that sense, if you see this as yellow, that is not objective or subjective. That simply is the data. And then when we talk about, and the same is true if somebody sees it as gray, that's the data in the form he gets it. Objective or subjective comes really into the question, what do you do with your mind on the conceptual level? Do you conform to the data or do you depart from it? And that, of course, means that the data per se precede that question. They simply are. And the same would be true on the case of cherry pie. It's really a physical sensation. Therefore, that you have it is simply a fact if you feel the pleasure, the pleasure on your taste buds, or if you don't. That is simply a given fact, and I would say per se that is not objective or subjective. When you rise to identify and you say, I like it, you're applying certain concepts to it, then you're describing a fact, and then that fact per se is objective, and that's universally true. So the best way is to remember that the concept of objective and subjective applies only on the conceptual level, and subjective is really describes not the personal, not the optional, not the sensory. The actual real meaning of subjective is a certain kind of aberration in the use of the conceptual faculty. Namely, a departure from facts in the process of coming to a conclusion. That's the actual technical meaning of subjective. So it's a very loose usage to equate it with the personal, the important, the optional, or the sensory.
Now,
Yes?
I have a follow-up. On the, you say that optional choices are a subcategory of objective?
I say that there are optional choices within objective principles, yes, definitely. In other words, philosophy is concerned with principles, not with dictating their concrete applications. And there are many, many different ways that you can apply the same principle, and nothing in philosophy or reality will say it has to be this one rather than that one. In that regard, for instance, taking a completely different type of example, in giving a presentation of an idea. And I gave certain principles. You should motivate the audience, you should have a certain structure, you should concretize. But no one could possibly tell you the motivation has to be in this concrete form versus that, you see. Now that would be an option, a way different form of implementing the same basic principle. Philosophy pertains only to the principles, and so does any art, really. And in that sense, the only danger with this formulation is that you understand what a principle is, so you won't think you can do anything and say it comes under some principle. But if you understand that you have to define the principle, but that it subsumes a whole variety of concretes and applies to any one of them, then there's no problem with this. It's simply the issue of the concept table being all the tables with their measurements omitted. If you know that, you'd have no problem. If you don't, I don't want to discuss it right here, so I would suggest you reread it from that aspect. Yes?
Would it have been helpful if she had established with you what you would have taken for an answer, what you would have taken for
What I would have, you say would have been helpful if she'd established what I would have taken for an answer to what?
What you would have taken as a proof that objectivity is possible.
Well, if she had asked me as an opponent of objectivity, what would you take as a proof that objectivity is possible? I would have said nothing. I mean, I would have said the word nothing. I would have said I don't take anything as proof because I don't believe there is such a thing. That's what the opponents would say.
That would end the argument.
Well, you say that would end the argument. Not necessarily. It would depend on whether she could convince me there was something to it. See, there could be an honest and a dishonest arguer. Now, most people who argue against objectivity are skeptics on principle. Therefore, they just want to blow up the possibility of knowledge. And they simply want you to force you to admit nobody can really know anything and anybody can say anything he wants. If you get that type, there's really no use going on past a certain point because it quickly degenerates into says you and says you, you know. But if a person is doing it for other than, let us say, nihilistic reasons, just to tear down the possibility of knowledge, then you could say, I wouldn't exactly say, what would you take as a proof of objectivity? Because he'd say, well, I don't know what I would take. But you could say to him, well, why don't you believe in it? What makes you think it's impossible to have? After all, we have a civilization. It seems that we know something, so what is it that makes you reticent? You know, what makes you in doubt about it? And then that would put me more on the defensive. And then I'd say something like, people disagree. Then she'd immediately say, well, that's irrelevant. Then she'd use the word reality, and I'd say, what's that? And then she'd sweep her hand around and say, it's that. And then I'm already starting to try to remember, what did I learn in philosophy class as to why objectivity isn't possible? So if she could get me to that point, we're in business. Yes?
You said that certain options, you have certain options after you've defined your principle, how to constitute.
Yes.
But then can you say that one option is better than another?
No, you cannot, by definition, if something is an option, you cannot say one is superior to the other, philosophically, among options. You certainly could say, in a particular context, that there are reasons why one choice seems preferable to another. But then you're changing the terms. For instance, yes?
For instance,
yes.
You talked about the presentation.
Right.
Motivating the audience.
Right.
Didn't we have a discussion last week about one motivation is better than
Sure. And I was going to just give exactly that example. There are options and then there are options. For instance, you can say you have to motivate an audience. That's the principle. So it's objectively wrong, if you understand that principle, to simply come in and say, good evening. Objectivity is possible because concepts are based, etc., and just rattle it off without any motivation. That's wrong. But then, within motivation, there are options. In part, those can be dictated by circumstances, but however you specify the circumstances, you will not uniquely come down to one. For instance, you can say, an audience that's already had 2 courses in concept formation will take a different kind of motivation on that subject of objectivity than an audience who's had nothing on it. But however you specify the audience, you are never going to be able, it will be rationalism to think that from the principle of motivation, you could deduce some one concrete opening, because there are countless possibilities, even with any set of concretes, you see. So from that point of view, sure, not every option makes sense in every circumstance. That's true even in the case of a career choice. Abstractly, there's dozens and dozens and thousands of careers that are legitimate. But suppose a person has just broken both ankles and is irredeemable and irreparable. It doesn't make sense to go into ballet. I mean, I give you a crude example, but there are obvious things pertaining to a particular individual that make certain choices less desirable than others, and you know, less obvious than that. So options, the existence of options doesn't mean that there's no means of choosing within them. It does mean that from philosophic considerations alone, you cannot uniquely narrow the application, because it would mean then philosophy is not a science of principles. There was a branch that used to be practiced in the medieval period called casuistry, which was specifically the attempt to deduce the concrete from philosophy. So they wouldn't just tell you that you should, for instance, be productive or pray or whatever their thing was. They would tell you how many minutes you should pray on which days and which prayer, and that was allegedly all proved the same way that you should generally engage in prayer. And that would be the equivalent as though in philosophy you could set up a rule for career guidance, and someone would come and you'd interview them and say, well, according to the principles of philosophy, you should get a job at Hammacher Schlemmer. Now, that is what you cannot do, you see. That is where you have to apply the principles yourself, and there are many legitimate options, however you take the circumstances into account. So the trick with saying that, you see, is that there are always people who lust after subjectivism in their heart. And when they hear that there are all these options, they are quick to say everything is optional. And it's all a matter of opinion, and if I want to commit murder, that's my option. Now that's exactly what philosophy is needed to prevent, to define what are the principles, what are the limits, where does reality lay down certain terms, and where does it leave a certain option in implementation. But if you do understand that, yes, that's very important. Otherwise, you're back to those 2 schools again. The intrinsic school says everything is dictated, there are no options. And the subjective school says nothing comes from reality, it's all completely subjective. And the actual truth is objectivity. Reality is recognized by man's mind, but since it's recognized conceptually, we grasp things with their measurements omitted, if you know what I mean by that, and therefore the application to concretes gives a certain range of option. All right, let us take a break here. Thank you. Now I have a number of written questions. On the assumption that we will not always be arguing with irrational people, wouldn't it make sense to stage a practice argument on a matter where it is possible that 2 rational people might disagree? Example, how should government be financed? Is euthanasia ever moral, etc.? Well, I don't agree with the premise of this question. I don't believe any of the topics that we actually discussed were ones which it would be impossible for rational people to disagree upon. In other words, I don't believe that being opposed to capitalism, believing in God, or even not knowing how to defend objectivity necessitates irrationality. In all these cases, it is possible. And my experience sometimes actually occurs that the person is simply ignorant, which is not the same as irrational. Irrational means anti-reason, willfully departing from reason, in effect intellectually dishonest. And particularly younger people today may have no idea that a case can be made for objectivity or capitalism, and whether they're rational or not comes out in the course of the argument. Do they listen? Do they answer? Are they obviously just completely brainwashed by things and they're helpless, or are they actively trying to subvert you and they're closed? Which in itself is sometimes a hard thing to say. So I would never have chosen a subject if I believed only an irrational person could hold it. But I don't believe that was the case of any of the subjects that we mentioned. And since these are the types of subjects that come up in actual philosophic discussions, they're much broader and more instructive to analyze than the particular examples mentioned here. Does the concept religion necessarily imply faith or a belief in the supernatural? Yes, I would say, absolutely. Please define it and differentiate it from philosophy. Religion is a primitive form of philosophy. It is a type of philosophy, but it's differential. What distinguishes it from other forms of philosophy is specifically that it appeals to faith. Religion is a view of the universe, of man's means of knowledge, therefore of man, and of values. That's essential to any religion. Whether they call it God or nirvana or whichever, is some kind of idea of what is reality, established but absolutely not by scientific means, because then it would be science. It has to be established at some form by faith, mysticism, mystic experience, belief, revelation, etc. If it was established simply by observation and reasoning therefrom, it would be simply another science like physics, chemistry, biology, botany. You would never get to something that is opposite to science. And if you went by science, you could never get to something infinite, something that contradicts what we know by our senses, that contradicts everything we know by our mind, whereas the essence of God or the supernatural in any definition is not merely something different from what we perceive, but something which contradicts what we perceive, something that's unlimited, infinite, omnipotent, so it can suspend cause and effect, omniscient, it has knowledge without any means, etc. And of course, in ethics, the essence of it is some form of value code prescribed by this supernatural being, whatever it is. So religion, I would say, is a mystical form of philosophy that specifically invokes faith or the supernatural, and therefore that is inherent in it. This, by the way, is not a point which distinguishes objectivism. This is widely recognized by advocates and opponents of religion in philosophy in this century. Now here is a question which is very interesting, but there would be no answer other than read Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology from cover to cover. How does one validate a conceptual theory? And then the question, it gives Miss Rand's definition of art and says, I realize in principle you can't go into it, but how do you arrive at and validate definitions? I wouldn't even know how to begin on condensing that. You'd first have to say, what are concepts and what is their basis in reality? What are definitions and why are they necessary? At what stage of development are they necessary? And then according to what principles should they be formed? And how do those principles follow from the nature of the function of a definition and concept formation? And after you did all that, which is Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, you'd have to then apply it to any particular one that you were interested in. If it's the theory of art, for instance, the definition of art, you have to say, what concretes are you trying to isolate? And you'd point to a statue and a symphony and a novel, etc.? What are their similarities as against what differences? And then what is the fundamental explaining those similarities? And if you work through that, you would need, therefore, two books. You'd need first Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology to give you the method, and then the Romantic Manifesto to validate it, that particular definition. So I couldn't even begin on that one. The Founding Fathers believed that knowledge is objective, but that reason, the ability to grasp and form knowledge, is given to man by God. How do you defend the origin of reason without basing it on God? Well, I would make a distinction between the nature of a faculty and its origin. What is it, and where does it come from? Now, if you're talking about something other than the entire universe, the question of origin is a question. You can't ask for the origin of the universe because the universe is everything. But you can ask for the origin of man, or the origin of the earth, or the origin of man's faculty of reason, or whatever, because presumably these particular forms of existence are not eternal. They developed from antecedent factors, and theoretically you could trace out what their origin was. So the question per se is legitimate, but, but, it is not a philosophic question. Philosophy cannot discuss origins. That is a purely scientific question. Philosophy is concerned with the nature of the mind, not with where did it come from. Where it came from is a question of biology, psychology, the development of life, the development of organisms, the development of the brain. That is a question of the special sciences. That is nothing that philosophy has any means to answer. And you have to be very careful to always remember what is the province of philosophy and what isn't. Philosophy is concerned with the essential principles in certain specific fields. In the theory of knowledge, philosophy says, that which is where reason would come in, given man with a certain kind of brain and certain kind of senses, given that, how does he acquire knowledge? How? How should he use his faculties to gain knowledge? Philosophy can say nothing about where those faculties came from, except by some natural means. But then it's up to physics, physiology, chemistry, psychology, and it makes no difference. It has no philosophic significance what the answer is. Suppose you found out that some ape in the caves 10 zillion years ago ate too much orange juice, and that's what caused... or too little. What's the difference? Whatever it was, it finally ended up that we have the mind and the faculty of reason. That's all that makes any difference, and that we survive by the use of it. Therefore, origins are outside of the question of philosophy and have no philosophic significance. Of course, the origin of the universe is a philosophic issue because that question is illegitimate, since the universe is everything. So, in philosophy, you don't defend the origin of reason. You simply say that's outside of philosophy, but certainly you can't accept mystic origins of anything, because mysticism is wrong on purely philosophic grounds. So if someone said reason comes from God, you simply say we start with reason and nature, and we don't give mystic explanations of natural facts. What is wrong with having a natural God who created human beings in the same way as a scientist creates a robot? Wouldn't Mr. Thomas's definition of God apply in such a case? If not, why not? Well, now he had several definitions of God. Which one? You mean presumably the superior living being? Well, that's true then. There is a God, if you want to use that. Your parents. Your parents created you, just as, not just as, but the scientist created a robot. He caused certain reorganizations of antecedently existing matter, and the result was the robot. And your parents get together, perform their act, and the result is certain reorganizations which produce you. They are natural beings. They produce you by a natural process, so if that's all you're talking about, fine. That's a perfectly natural process. And they are, his definition was superior living being. They're certainly superior to you at the beginning by many criteria: knowledge, power, wealth, you name it. Over you as a baby, your parents have you completely, so that would be it then. So now we proved there's a God. You see, the whole thing about God is that you cannot do it linguistically. You can't just say, give the term God to some natural process or entity and then say, well, that exists, so obviously there's a God. Because you will see that by the very fact that it is natural, that it's finite, limited, established by perception or inference therefrom, it loses all its religious, mystical significance. It's no longer God. The best example of this that I can remember was a TV show where one person said, arguing the atheist position, said that he believed in not only God but polytheism, and the other, many gods. And the other person, the religious person, said, what do you mean? Polytheism? Well, I can easily prove that there are many gods. And he took out a package of cigarettes. And he said, here's 20 gods right here. Since I define God as the tube of tobacco encased in white paper. Now, the other person said, well, be sensible. That isn't God. And said, why not? Well, God has to have a certain dignity and so on. And then when you asked him what it has to be, as long as it remains on the natural level, it is simply another object in the universe. It's not the creator of the universe. As soon as it becomes the creator of the universe, and therefore it becomes something which you could call God meaningfully, by that very fact it becomes mystical, supernatural, and all the other objections apply. A natural God is truly a contradiction in terms. The closest to it was the Olympics, not the Olympics, the Greek religion, Zeus and so on. Those were gods who were finite and limited. They were natural beings, but they were quickly abandoned by theologians because on that level, everybody and his brother could make up anything they wanted, and you couldn't distinguish gods from gremlins and a whole weird mythology. So, but they were the closest you could come to natural gods, the Greek gods. But they were really actually just another race of living beings. In reference to judging intellectual dishonesty on the part of an opponent, if he engages in extreme anger, hostility, and insults, what does this imply about his psychology? Guilt over massive evasion. I don't know. I'm very hesitant about making inferences about somebody's psychology. The only thing I would say for sure is he is obviously threatened and fearful of you or of the situation, if it's extreme anger, hostility, and insults. Whether it's massive evasion or something else, I don't know. I wouldn't comment on that. People can get very angry without necessarily, and even very threatened without necessarily being monsters. It depends if they're angry from morning to night every day of the week, in what circumstances, and so on. Now, here's a question that's I cover in my course on objectivism, but I can't escape it because it comes directly up here. Last week when you were asked what makes man think, you answered human nature. I just interject to say not exactly. I said you can't ask what makes man think, but that the basic cause of the choice to think or not is the nature of man, specifically the nature of his mind. And the question goes on, I cannot conceive of what it means when you say man can choose to not think, because even to make that choice involves a thought process. And he's concluded that man is always thinking. And then he goes on to elaborate, is there any part of this that you disagree with? All of it. So I won't bother reading the whole next paragraph, because you are equivocating here. The choice to not think does not involve a thought process. You are looking at it as though when a person decides not to think, he does it like this. Now let me see. There is a fact here before me which requires my attention. On the other hand, I do not decide, I don't want to expend the energy to think about this, and since thinking would take a certain amount of energy, I therefore conclude that I will not think. That is a process of thought. That is not the normal process by which a person decides to not think. That's how a rational person would decide not to think about a certain subject. But when we talk about to think or not to think, we mean thinking versus mental stagnation, evasion. And there, what you are essentially doing is not coming to conclusions at all. You just simply turn the mechanism off, or you lower the degree of awareness. You just let the mind. It's not a conceptual process. You don't defend it. You don't identify it. You don't think at all. You just let it go out of focus. The closest you can grasp this without a long discussion is what you can do with your eyes. You could just let them go, or put your finger in and everything just goes blur. Now that you can do in your mind without putting your finger in it, simply by letting it go. And that is a process of simply not expending the energy necessary to keep it taut, aware, focused, purposeful, integrating. All you have to do is not expend that energy, and your mental threshold of awareness diminishes. You go back to, in effect, the perceptual level where you're still conscious, but you connect nothing. You're not on the premise of perceiving, grasping anything new, coming to conclusions, etc. No thought is required to reach that decision, simply turning it off. And that you can do wordlessly. So I would say that the equivocation here is the choice to not think involves a mental process. Namely, you simply are turning it off. But that's not mental, doesn't mean conceptual or thinking. Now, here are two questions that are important. They're really the same, so I'll read them both. But it represents an important misunderstanding, which I'm happy to have a chance to clarify. One says, I didn't understand what you said about dismissing studies someone is quoting in an argument. When someone quotes studies in an argument, how can you just dismiss them out of hand? Isn't that person justified then in dismissing facts that I present? And the other says, would you clarify your position regarding your attitude toward facts offered by opponents in an argument? If you can arbitrarily reject an opponent's facts, he should have the same privilege. Suppose you want to use Soviet Russia as an example of the failure of socialism and quote statements, and then he lists various books. But your opponent says he refuses to accept those studies as fact. How can you argue without facts? Now, as I say, I want definitely to correct the impression that I say in any situation, it's perfectly okay just to wander in, and if anybody says anything, say that's out. I reject those facts out of hand. Obviously, that would be out of the question. I was talking in a specific context, namely, you are discussing a philosophic issue. You are trying to get the discussion onto the main philosophic dispute between the two of you. He keeps peppering you with facts after you have contested his sources, and you're trying to make it into an issue of principle. And there's a point at which you are entirely justified in saying, look, on the level of facts, you can argue till doomsday. Every book that you cite one way, I'll cite another way. We're not going to resolve anything this way. So there's no use. If we're going to have a discussion, let us define the principles involved. We can't interpret what are the facts that are reliable or not until we have some framework to know what the situation is. And in regard to Russia, for instance, if we know that there is a massive propaganda from the Russians or the communist sympathizers to the effect that everything in Russia is wonderful, including dozens of eyewitnesses who were taken on tours of the Kremlin and so on and brought back, and it's how magnificent. And on the other hand, you do have eyewitnesses telling you how awful things are. And you have not been to Russia. Do you have to be there yourself to decide? Obviously not. If you were there, that per se wouldn't decide, because it depends what they would show you. How are you going to judge that? Does it mean facts are irrelevant? No. It means you have to integrate theory and practice. But you do have to integrate, which means you have to keep in mind what is the basic philosophy. Now, here is where you can't even assess the facts until you know something about man's nature and what would life be like under complete totalitarianism. You first have to know that. Only then can you say, well, if man's, I'm not going to try and give you the whole argument in one shot, but in essence you'd be saying, if man survives by the use of his mind, and the mind requires freedom, and Soviet Russia is a dictatorship, then it has to be suffering and woe of some kind. It has to be, because it's counter to everything, all the facts I know on my own about human nature and about man's requirements. Then you can say, If you want examples, read this book and this book. But without that foundation, it's just his word against somebody else's word. On the other hand, if the guy could establish man is inherently lonely, and if he lives in a free country, he's riddled necessarily with fear because he doesn't know what to do, he's helpless. Whereas if he lives in a dictatorship, he has security. If he could establish that, then you would be more inclined to say, well, then they must be happy in Russia, or at least they have a better chance than we have here. It's not that facts are irrelevant. It's that you can't take facts out of context. Philosophy gives you the basic integration of the kinds of facts that are available to anybody in any country at any age. It gives you the nature of man. That is then the foundation alone in which you can interpret somebody else's facts one way or the other. You can then see, does it integrate with what you know, or does it clash, even if you yourself can't validate those facts. That's why at a certain point you should say to the person, look, these facts are all controversial. You hold this, other people say opposite. Let's just throw the whole thing out and see, are we going to talk about ideas or quit talking? Now, the shorthand way is, if you get exasperated, I reject that. I reject all of it. There's no use citing me any more facts because I reject your source and this is my reason. And then you discuss the philosophic issue. It's in that sense that I meant you can dismiss out of hand a torrent of facts. I mean a torrent of facts poured at you without reference to philosophy on an issue which is inherently philosophical. That you can dismiss and you can defend your dismissal. You do not have to be a scholar. But you shouldn't make it sound as though I said, oh, facts are irrelevant. You just wander around and say anything you want, and if anybody says something against you, say, that's a fact. To hell with facts. I'm a philosopher. You can't do that, and it makes philosophy in a very bad light, because the question is, where do the philosophers get their principles from, if not from facts? Now, I take it that this is a compliment, this question. How did you ever get a job teaching philosophy? Actually, I don't have a job teaching philosophy. So you better ask that in about another year. This is asking about, am I going to offer an advanced class? Would I please announce it before the last class for those of us who won't be here then? If I know before the last class, I will. Do I have any questions from the floor now before I go to any other written ones? Yes.
What is a formal definition of principle?
You want a formal definition of principle. On principle, I shouldn't give a definition because that's what dictionaries are for. And it's very hard to give a formal, exact definition off the top of your head. In the broad sense, I could simply say a principle is an abstract or general truth, subsuming countless instances. But you see, you need a context there, because there are cases where you can distinguish principle from law, cases where principle is used very broadly. Sometimes the two terms are used interchangeably, like you say, the principle of identity, the law of identity. So you need a special context. Are you making a distinction or what? Sometimes, for instance, principle is applied only where action is involved. So you'd say the law of identity, but the principle of causality, you see. That's why I would rather not, except in a specific context, or if there is some philosophic issue in dispute, because definitions as such, if you go to the best dictionary, which is the Oxford English Dictionary, you will find page after page, and it degenerates into usage, simply unless you define a specific context. Some other question over here. Yes?
Yes, well, I'm sorry to say mine was the same.
Well, if I know a definition offhand, I'll give it. If not, I'll refer you to the dictionary. What is it?
You gave precise definition of subjectivity, and I wanted to know if I had written it down.
Oh, well, that's okay. Since I gave it, I know it. You want to say, did you give the right definition of subjectivity? What did you take down?
I said departure from facts, and then I put in parentheses factual data when coming to a conclusion.
Departure from facts when coming to a conclusion. Well, that is substantially the idea. I would not word it exactly that way in a writing for the reason that it is too close to other concepts. A falsehood is something that departs from facts. Subjective pertains not so much, to be exact, to the final relation between the conclusion and the facts, but to the relation between the process of coming to that conclusion and the facts. In other words, you can have a conclusion which departs from the facts, which is, in other words, false or mistaken, which is nevertheless objective. You see, in other words, you simply made a mistake. You tried to take into account all the facts. You were objective in your mental process, but the result was a mistake. So don't equate subjective with any form of error. That's why, you see, if you call it just departure from the facts, it sounds like any time you make a mistake, you're subjective or vice versa. Subjective versus objective, in the literal sense, pertains to the method of using your mind. It means in the process of coming to a conclusion, what guides you? Do you try to look at facts, to summon your knowledge, to bring in logic? Or do you just say, I feel so-and-so, and to hell with it? You see, it's the method you use. Now, you may say, I feel so-and-so, and it happens your feeling is right. So you came by accident to a true conclusion, only you're being subjective, so it's of no use to you. You don't know that it's true. Or the reverse, you could be objective, follow the facts as well as you can, but you're ignorant about something, so your conclusion is mistaken. You see that those are not the same thing. But if you understand that subjective and objective apply to the process of using the mind, the method you follow, then in that sense, subjective designates a conceptual process which deliberately departs from the facts and it really amounts to in order to follow certain feelings, because there's really nothing left. If you depart from the facts, there's nothing else you can get guidance from ultimately but your emotions, your feelings. Even if you depart in order to conform to other people's ideas, for instance, arbitrarily, you're still following them because you feel that that's what you want to do. So you're still, it's ultimately out there or in here. And in here, if you take aside concepts, is only your feelings. So subjective is really reliance on emotions to come to conclusions. That's the, does that make it clear?
Very.
Another question somewhere? Yes.
You mentioned briefly the difficulties of arguing in a television kind of format. Now, more than a year ago, Ms. Rand appeared here in New York on Mr. Donahue's.
Right.
Could you describe, if you know, the reasons behind that?
I don't understand what you mean by the reasons. Why did she agree to appear? I don't know why that would be a question. She agreed to appear because he asked her to appear. It was a national hookup. He was going to... Pardon?
It was very difficult under the circumstances of 4,000 people in a room, etc.
Yes, I would only say this much. I think he could have handled his part better than he did.
Context back here, please.
Yes, the question was only, I guess I didn't repeat it, but why did Miss Rand agree to appear on the Donahue show? But I don't really see the answer to that. I mean, why that's a problem. If she wants to publicize her ideas, she had reason to believe in advance that it would be polite. And within certain limits it was. I think he overstepped the bounds, definitely, in certain respects, but I don't believe that he announced that to her in advance, and had he, she certainly would not have. I'm not even at all sure that he knows the extent to which he did. So I wouldn't really want to get into the personalities of that particular thing more broadly. If you ask about appearing on TV, I would say you want to disseminate your ideas. If you know what you're talking about and you have reason to believe it is not a show that is restricted to crackpots, then go right ahead, absolutely. If you think you can get a certain minimum civility. And it is a gamble. But you always have this out. If it becomes intolerable, you just walk off. And then they're stuck. So you can always do that. But the great majority of cases, that is not true. If you've seen Miss Rand on other shows, That has not been the case, that there have been that type of problem. Okay, we've reached our time. Let me just remind you again to read the first 2 items on the homework for next time. Thank you.